Hello everyone, welcome to the latest video on liberalism. Today I thought we'd have a look at liberalism and the state. So in the previous video we were looking at human nature, which as I said is fundamental to all the different ideologies. It affects their views of everything. Well, the same is true for liberalism and the state. So if you remember from the previous video, liberals believe that human nature is rational, that individualism is key, and that everyone is self-seeking. And because of this, we therefore require the state. Now, all liberals, or most liberals, tend to agree that the state essentially is a necessary evil, and it's needed to avert disorder, and it's also needed to protect our natural rights. Remember, these natural rights are really important for liberals. The natural rights of life, so everyone has the right to live and to do as they please, largely speaking. Everyone has the right to liberty, so freedoms to act and believe in what they wish to, and also the right to property, and that property should be protected. So our natural rights is life, liberty and property. And the state is needed in order to avert disorder and to protect these things. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, I thought that liberals had a fairly positive view of human nature. They believe that in the state of nature, people would generally get on okay. So why do you need a state to provide order in this particular society? And the reason is because we're self-seeking and individualistic, we therefore maybe inadvertently or possibly advertently, in order to pursue our self-interest, we may well trample on other people's individuals' life, liberty and property. And therefore you need a state to provide the rules, I suppose, the structure, in order to prevent people from taking away other people's life, liberty and property. There's the famous quote, isn't there, from our key thinker John Locke, who said, "Where there's no law, there's no freedom." So in other words, we need the law from the state in order to provide that framework where people's freedoms can be protected, or everyone's freedoms can be protected, and it kind of limits to some extent some of our kind of self-pursuit too much. In the words of one of the American founding fathers, I can't remember which one it was, either Hamilton, Jefferson or Madison, one of them said anyway, if men were angels, there'd be no need for government. Well, men are not angels, because men are self-seeking and individualistic. Therefore, we do need some rules in order to protect everybody. This is something which classical liberals believe, like John Locke. It's also something which modern liberals believe as well. People like Rawls and Frieden and Green and other modern liberals, they too believe that the state is needed in order to protect people's life, liberty and property. And that is the main role of the state. I suppose the only difference between the two strands of liberalism is that from a classical liberal point of view, that is basically the main role of the state, whereas modern liberals have a much more kind of positive view of the state. Yes, the state is there to provide order, it is a necessary evil, but they also see it in a much more positive way as well. The state actually should be more proactive in defending these things. So we'll have a look at in a couple of minutes' time. Another factor which liberals tend to agree on regarding the state is that there is some kind of social contract. This is something which John Locke pursued. The liberal philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who we'll meet when we do about liberal nationalism, they argue for this social contract. So the idea is that people volunteer to have a state. So we volunteer to restrict some of our freedoms in order to have security, in order to ensure that everyone in society can pursue their interests. So some of my freedoms may be restricted slightly in order to ensure we have freedom. And we do this from a very rational point of view. We all recognise, as we're all rational, that we do need to follow certain rules. We do need to limit perhaps our behaviour slightly in order to ensure that the maximum rights are given to the maximum amount of people, I suppose. And liberals also believe, from both the classical and the modern point of view, that the government should be the servant, not the master. Again, this is a quote from John Locke. So governments are created by people, we have a contract with the state, so we volunteer to give up some of our freedoms in exchange for security, but we are in control of that government. And this is another area which liberals do struggle a little bit with the state, because they believe that government should be restricted. Now, because individuals are self-interested, because we should pursue our self-interest, liberals from a modern and a classical point of view have a suspicious view, I suppose, towards those who seek power. The idea that politicians seek power to become president or prime minister or whatever, but then because they are individuals and because they wish to pursue their self-interest, then they may well be tempted to use that power they've gained to pursue their own self-interest, to give PPE contracts to their friends, possibly in a modern setting, or to increase their power over others. And so as a consequence of this, liberals very much believe, from both a classical and a modern point of view, that government should be restricted. There should be various means which limits what governments can do in order to reduce the threat, I suppose, of them using this self-interest for themselves. So, for example, from a classical point of view, people like Locke, but also much later, they supported governments with various checks and balances. The American Constitution is seen as a really good example of this, which we'll look at in the second year. This idea that, on the one hand, you give a person like a president some powers, but on the other hand, you take away those powers by giving it to a different institution. Devolution is, I suppose, a modern concept in the UK of whereby power is being restricted. So the UK government in London has certain powers, but increasingly Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have got certain powers as well. Again, you saw this fragmentation of power, I suppose, during the whole COVID situation. And of course, something which developed really from the late Victorian period onward, another way which the people have some control over who's in charge, is by having regular elections. John Stuart Mill, our key thinker, he favoured that certain women should be able to vote in the late 1800s, although he was worried about mob rule if everyone had the right to vote. He thought the educated should be able to vote. More modern liberals like Rawls and Frieden, they believe that everyone should have the right to vote. And again, it's a way of restricting government. They know they've got to face the voters on a regular basis. They're answerable to the voters. It restricts what they can do. So they're the main areas where liberals agree, although, as I've kind of highlighted, there are some disagreements within that as well. I suppose the main disagreement amongst liberals regarding the state is kind of the size and the real functions of what that state should do. So classical liberals, John Locke, the American founding fathers, they believed in something called the night watchman state. I don't think they termed that phrase, but that's what it's become known as. And what this basically is a very, very small state. The main job, the main purpose of the state is simply to avert disorder and protect natural rights of life, liberty and property. So it should pass laws which means that someone can't nick someone else's property, people's lives should be protected, that type of thing. Well, the state should be limited into just those areas. Thomas Jefferson, one of the American founding fathers, said, when the government grows, our liberty withers. So again, it's this fear that if a government that does more than that will then begin to take away our freedoms. So classical liberals, they were scared to death, I suppose, of big governments taking away our freedoms, which might not be surprising considering the time they were in. John Locke was in the mid-17th century where you had monarchical governments. This belief that government should be small, the state should confine itself to protecting life, liberty and property, and that's about it. Modern liberals, though, increasingly rejected that view. John Stuart Mill, one of our key thinkers, he begins his life as a classical liberal and kind of by the end becomes much more of a modern liberal. And his life in that Victorian period saw this big change, At the start of the Victorian period, Britain was mainly agricultural, had been for decades, I suppose, by the end of his life, Britain had become much more industrialised, with industrial workers, poor living and working conditions, etc., etc., etc. And liberalism kind of it reacted to this social change by actually saying, well, actually, how free are people if they're being forced to, work down the mines for 12 hours a day on very little pay? Are they really not much better than slaves if that's what they're doing? Or how free are people to pursue their self-interest or pursue their opportunities if they don't have an education? And so what modern liberals believe in, they reject the idea of the night watchman state, because they say that doesn't help people become free, it just kind of perpetuates the current situation. They support something called the enabling state, a much bigger state. The state should be involved in ensuring that everyone has the opportunities to have their freedom and their individual rights protected. It's not good enough, they argue, for the state to say, not our business, we just pass laws to make sure you don't get murdered in your sleep, or people don't nick your latest trainers and stuff. The enabling state has this idea that some people can't pursue their talents, their individualism, because they've been born into poverty, and the state must do something about that so that these people have the ability to pursue their self-interest. So the enabling state was something which was developed by a key thinker called Green, who's not one of our key thinkers, so he probably should be. Rawls and Betty Friedan, our two key thinkers, are kind of associated with this. In particular, John Rawls, our American friend, he wrote in 1971 a book called A Theory of Justice. He argued for absolute freedom, equality of opportunity, which is one of his big ideas, that the state should provide the opportunity for everyone to pursue their self-interest. Now, if people choose not to, that's up to them. Well, the state should provide first-class education system, healthcare system, so people at least have the ability to then pursue their self-interest. And also, priority should be given to help the disadvantaged as well. Now, the enabling state is a much bigger state than what the classical liberals had. And in fact, this is something which you can see classical liberals would really fear. When Thomas Jefferson is saying, when the government grows, our liberty withers, you can see how you'd be kind of terrified by this enabling state. Because, of course, the enabling state is going to take away, in theory, some more of our freedoms, because these things are expensive. Providing a first-class healthcare system, education system, this costs money. And that money has to be taken, doesn't it, from people. It's like our property is being given to the state in order to redistribute. And again, classical liberals fear this, and of course, I suppose the modern reincarnation of them are neoliberals. So, liberals then, overall, fundamentally agree that the state is a necessary evil. Modern liberals have got a slightly more positive view of the state than classical liberals, but they all recognise it's necessary. They all recognise that the state is there to be the servant of the people, not the other way around. And they all recognise that there should be limitations on governments, whether that be through elections, whether that be through constitutional mechanisms. And the reason for that is that they believe that individuals who are kind of running the state, prime ministers, presidents, are ultimately self-seeking and therefore need to be restricted. The main area of disagreement amongst liberals is over the size of that state. Classical liberals are small state, a night watchman state, a state that just deals with protecting life, liberty and property and not much else, whereas the enabling state of the modern liberals is a much bigger state, a more proactive state, a state which is getting itself involved in economics and politics in order to ensure that people have, good education, good healthcare coverage, passing laws which are preventing discrimination against certain groups, all of these sorts of things. So they're the main areas. I think I've covered most of them there on liberalism and the state. So the next video I'll do, I'll try and do either later on today or possibly tomorrow.